Many of you have probably heard the expression to cook a frog in a frying pan. To do this, you must set the frog on a frying pan and turn the pan up 1 degree every hour. This sounds like a very slow process, and it is. But the frog will become used to each degree change after every hour. Too rapidly, it gets anxious and wants to move. After 100 hours, the frog will be cooked. The moral of this story is simply that eventually, as time goes on, you become used to the last and more susceptible to the next. Which leads me into today's topic. Who is to blame for the levels of violence on TV? To answer today's question, I will view it in 3 areas of analysis. Number 1, levels of violence in the US in real life and in other medias in the past, the levels of violence on TV today, and how we can see the levels of violence change in the future. For my first area of analysis, the levels of violence in the US in the real life and in other medias during the past. Now, the United States is a relatively young country compared to its European counterparts. In fact, we are also one of the few countries to be settled on the new continent, the New World. Upon this, most of the world is frontier, full of hostilities and violence we couldn't comprehend. Most of our people who lived on this nation were pioneers who saw this violence. They became, in a term the media likes to say today, desensitized to it. The killing that would happen on the frontier land became something that was everyday, something that was normal, not something to be, look away from this, it's something you won't see. Also, another thing is the Americas are a predominantly Christian nation, something that prefers to shy away from sexual exploitation. Because of this, we can begin to see that people were not so likely to embrace the other side of violence. Because of this, when media started popping up, around the time of radio, the FCC enacted strict laws against both violence and sexual exploitation. However, because it wasn't seen, only heard, they were less strict about it. You weren't seeing the violence making you desensitized to it, only hearing it. Because of this, as time would go on, people became less repulsed by the levels of violence on radio. You would hear gunfire now instead of just punches being thrown. You would hear people screaming as gunfire was shot off. This became common occurrence over time, and people stopped being shied away from it. Because just like the frog, you have now turned the pan up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The frog still hasn't moved. This leads me into my second area of analysis. The levels on TV today. The violence levels on TV today are much higher than that of Europe today, or even that of the radio in the past. What we can agree upon this is the fact that we've become used to the violence of the radio and we're ready to move up. The FCC would loosen the regulations on that than they would others. Now, many people would also complain about the level of sexual exploitation on TV. However, in an interview, director J.J. Abrams, famous for movies such as Star Trek and working on some other popular TV shows, he said that they prefer to use sexual exploitation as a last step. If ratings are very low and they know their show is going to be canceled soon, they'd like to draw up that card. It makes audiences very mad. Parents don't like their children to watch this. Violence, however, parents can be reasoned with. Because of this, parents are going to allow their children to watch this on a more weekly basis than they would other shows. You can also see that children are going to respond more to this than they would the other opposite. They're going to prefer the action-y adventures you'd see on Saturday morning cartoons or that of some hit show like Game of Thrones. As you can see now, it makes sense that people would be using more violence than they would the opposite. As they do this, we become more, as the media likes to say, desensitized to it. And when the FCC wants to loosen regulations, we'll be okay with it. The idea won't be, well, what about the children? That'll be an afterthought. The idea is, it's already there, how could it get worse? As you can see, other medias are going to start adopting this, unlike Europe, which has a very strict violence regulation. Europe will not allow most violence onto their TV. It's even less than what we have in the 80s, some might say. In the 80s, you couldn't see anyone getting punched most of the time. Even in the 60s Spider-Man cartoon show, 3 punches were swung in a 20-year showtime. That has changed, just like the opposite of Europe. In Europe, sexual exploitation is more used than violence. So because of this, violence rules get tougher and tougher every year than the opposite. They're desensitized to it than the other one. This leads me into my third and final area of analysis. How will violence levels increase in the future? As I've said previously, you can see we're becoming more and more desensitized to it. And when the FCC, they're in charge of most of our medias and entertainment, they're going to be okay with it. They will be okay with less strict violence laws than they would others. And as this happens, sexual exploitation will become more strict and stricter. The exact opposite of what Europe's done. We'll become desensitized to one and oblivious to the other. This is predictable within the next 20 years and will continue on all of America's lifespan. That is why, because of these 3 areas of analysis, America's levels of violence in the past, in real life, and in other medias, levels of violence on TV today, and how we can expect levels of violence to change in the future, I have to say that the only person you can blame for these levels are you. You become desensitized to it. You are the frog on the frying pan, and it's being turned up 1 degree every hour. And pretty soon, that frying pan is going to be at 100 degrees, and the floor is way too cold to step on.